Hello and welcome to Digital Photography's I3 lecture series. We are thrilled to have Marvin Heiferman as tonight's guest lecturer. Early in his career, Marvin was the assistant director of Light Gallery in New York, and later on director at Castelli Photographs. Selected exhibitions in New York include John Waters' Change of Life, New Museum of Contemporary Art, Paradise Now, Picturing the Genetic Revolution, Exit Art, and Fame After Photography, Museum of Modern Art. Marvin is a regular contributor to Art Forum, BOM, and the publications produced by MoMA, ICP, Whitney Museum of American Art, and other institutions. He is author of the books Love is Blind, I'm So Happy, Still Life, and most recently, Photography Changes Everything. Marvin is a faculty member in the MFA Photography and Related Media program at SVA, as well as the ICP Bard program at Bard College. On a personal note, in the early 90s, I was lucky enough to study with Marvin and the brilliant and much beloved Carol Kismarek. And I just want to say thank you, Marvin. Your teachings were really invaluable and have stayed with me all these years and inspired me to this day. So please help me welcome Marvin to our lecture series.
Thank you. Yeah, that's sweet, and what goes around comes around, right? It's interesting to be here on the other end of 21st Street tonight. Hi to students from the MFA photo program who I see here, past and present. It's great to be here tonight, and what I wanted to do was talk about some of the projects that I've done recently and kind of the way my thinking has changed around photographic imaging over the last couple of years. And want to start off by saying something that's obvious, but that people forget, which is that there is no single or simple story that you can tell about photography. That there are so many pictures that have been made by so many people for so many different reasons that tidy narratives about photography are impossible to construct or to defend. This is one version of the history of photography. This was a 1913 exhibition at the Smithsonian that was organized by a guy named Thomas Smiley, who was the first photographer at the Smithsonian and became their first photography curator. It's the unruliness of photography that makes it so fascinating. If you ask an artist or you ask a politician or a food stylist what a good photograph is and how it changes our experience of the world and in the world, you'll get three very, very different answers. And if you ask even more people about how they use and respond to photography in the many forms they take them and use them, you'll get a sense what triggered the Photography Changes Everything project, which was published last fall, and it's the most recent book that I did. Photography, which I love and look at all the time, helps and excites us, most of us, up to the point that we're always greedy to see more and more pictures. And given the ease of digital imaging, we're taking more pictures and we're sharing more pictures also. I love statistics about how many pictures are made, and they change all the time. But you know, this week the story is there's 1.3 billion new photographs made every day. It's estimated that about 350 million of them get posted to Facebook every day. That 250 million of them get posted to Google+. That 150 million more pictures are on Snapchat, and that 55 million pictures are on Instagram, and like 1.4 on Flickr, which I think is kind of interesting as they try to invent that. But all of those pictures or new pictures are being made every day, and any one of them can span the world in seconds. This is an installation that was done by an artist and book editor and book packager named Eric Kessels, who's from the Netherlands, who does terrific books. And this was something that he did at a project that Foam, the photography museum in Amsterdam, put together. What he did was print out all of the photographs that were uploaded to Flickr on a single day. So that's 1 million photographs. That's what they look like as things, right? And you know, I was fascinated by this idea. I didn't see this in person, but I'm fascinated by the fact that our need for photographs and the breadth of photography's reach and the medium's authority are, to use a really overused word, awesome. The more I thought about what photographs are, Susan Sontag wrote on photography, the more complex and suggestive they became. And that's why some people, and I'm one of them, are always trying to figure photography out. It was about 2004 based on a number of curatorial projects that I had done, like the Fame After Photography show that got mentioned, that I was invited to come to the Smithsonian. This is a daguerreotype made in 1846 by the architect of the Smithsonian, who worked and lived in Philadelphia, and they figured that he made it because it was easier to carry the daguerreotype than it was to carry a model back and forth from Philadelphia to Washington to show them the building that he was going to build. So I was invited by Mary Foresta, who at the time was the director of what was called the Smithsonian Photography Initiative, to develop programming around the 14 million photographs that are at the Smithsonian, which are housed in 1,000 distinct photographic collections at 19 museums and research institutions in Washington and New York and around the world, like in the Panama Canal Zone. And it was a meeting in this building about 2005, about a year later, that the idea that shape photography changes everything began to emerge. It was one of those transformative days in my life. We were sitting around in this fantastic room surrounded by taxidermied animals and all kinds of weird Smithsonian kind of stuff, right? That's beautiful and weird. But I was sitting around with a very eclectic bunch of people. There was the former director of a number of contemporary art museums. There was a noted astrophysicist, the guy who was the head of the Smithsonian Harvard Observatory, who's responsible for all of the image made by the Spitzer telescope, which is a kind of sister telescope to the Hubble. There was a geographer from Vassar, and strangest person of all, there was an information analyst from the CIA, whose job, it turns out, was to analyze the comings and goings of drug dealers by studying aerial thermographic images made of cars in parking lots to figure out when their car engines were turned on and off. Right. So we're all sitting around in a room together, and over the course of this day, we're having nice little sandwiches and potato chips, and everybody's talking about how photography works for them, right? How they use photography. And what was really interesting was that for each person in that room, photography was central to each one of their pursuits, which was kind of amazing. And what people realized was that they never really talked about that to each other. They didn't feel like they had the language to talk about it. Everybody in the room looked at, used photographs differently, and talked about them differently. And that what made for an effective photograph or a beautiful photograph or whatever kind of photograph for them depended entirely on who was doing the looking and who was doing the talking about these pictures. So I was going back and forth between Washington and New York, and I'm on the train coming back because I live here. And what struck me at the end of the day was this incredible dialogue that we had among us, which everybody there was equally excited about photographic imaging, right? But what struck me was that in recent decades, the most sustained discourse around photography, a tool that I was starting to see through this Smithsonian project and the way I'd been thinking over the years, a tool that's so central to our everyday lives, has tended to focus on a specific kind of photographic image, those made as art. Right? This is a John Baldessari called Frames and Ribbons. It's from 1988. So art museums talk about images made as art, or sometimes they talk about a handful of the vernacular images that over time get upgraded to the status of art. This is a Jacob Riis photograph from 1890. It's called 5 Cents a Spot, which is how much each one of those people paid to sleep in that room that night. So keeping in mind that I kind of come out of galleries and come out of that world and then kind of move over to the museum world and start thinking about photographs in a different kind of way after that. While the promotion of photography as art, like it seemed to me, has really helped to foster a serious and very, very interesting discussion about the medium, it's also created a big roadblock. As art historian Jeffrey Batchin describes it, photography is a sprawling cultural phenomenon inhabiting virtually every aspect of modern life that's consistently left out of its own history, because so few photographs qualify for inclusion in an art history of the medium, which I think is true and the case. When I started my career in photography, I started as an artist. I thought I was going to be a painter and got so interested in photography that I got diverted. My job was to help shape the careers of image makers such as Robert Adams and Louis Baltz and Nan Goldin, to name just a couple. But over the years, and in addition to working with artists and in art museums, I've gotten more and more interested and produced a lot of projects about the other less pedigreed kinds of images that are out there. So this is from the Fame After Photography show that was mentioned. This is in the kind of towards the beginning of a show. It's a cabinet about the size of, a little bit bigger than this, and those are 100 carte de visites of the famous people of the 19th century. This is celebrity in the 19th century, things the size of baseball cards. And the show kind of went from that to the 20th century to look at how photography had changed celebrity and changed the nature of renown, and was the first show, as far as I can tell, at MoMA where still photographs were included, books, television shows, movies, and internet sites, because this was around the time that Jenny Cam was happening in 1999. This was the first time that people were living online in real time and making themselves famous through that. So based on projects like this, and given the kinds of images that I was seeing and the kind of revelatory conversations I was having with people at the Smithsonian, I came to understand more clearly than ever, and in a way completely different than the way I was thinking when I was more coming out of the art world kind of corner, that conventional perspectives on photography need to be revisited. And we have to do that in order to more accurately reflect our interactions with photographs of all kinds. Today, in the midst of what people insist and keep calling a digital revolution, even though it's been going on for 40 years, right? This is the first digital camera. This is 1975. The thing is the size of a microwave oven, right? It's big, right? There's great pictures of the guy who invented it holding it. It's a fantastic thing. In the midst of this revolution, we're forging new relationships to photography. And as photography is being transformed, so are our relationships to reality and to each other. Photographed by a former SVA MFA student, Tina Latovsky.
We'll be speaking soon.
Oh yeah? There you go. There you go. We all come back, right? With that in mind, you know, this notion of how photography is changing the way we see the world, we see each other, we see ourselves. I came up with this project for the Smithsonian Photography Initiative to create this project that, interesting, this is a digital program. The project that became, that you see the book of, started out as an online project. From 2008 to 2010, I invited about 100 people to participate in this project. The project started as a website. It got built in public. The whole idea was, let's build this over time, let people come to it, let people see new things that we add to it, which was great. And the goal was to encourage people to think more broadly and critically about how photography functions as an active agent of social and cultural change. And this was, for me, like the big thing that switched in my head. It was like an on-off thing. I was working on this project in Washington, which even before it became a website was supposed to be exhibitions up and down the mall in Washington. It's initially I got hired to curate. I proposed simultaneous exhibitions at every museum of the Smithsonian, which was a goofy thing to try to do, and it turned out not to be possible to do it. But in the process of it, I decided I needed an intern to help me because I was being a little over-ambitious, and went to NYU's Museum Study program and talked to the head of it to see if I could get an intern, and it turned out that she was a visual anthropologist, right, who turned me on to a whole bunch of writing coming out of England. There's a whole bunch of visual anthropologists. Elizabeth Edwards is one of the people who's there writing about this. And they look at photography really differently than we were looking at photography in America. They were really looking at photographs as things, number one, back in the days of materiality, and they were also looking at photographs as agents of change, that photographs aren't these documentary things that sit there, that photographs do something. And that's where I was talking to people like her, and talking to, you know, astronomers, and talking to astrophysicists, and, you know, CIA spies or whatever they were. It just, you know, it was a really different kind of perspective on photography. And so I went out and talked to a lot of people. One of them was Stuart Brand, who was very well known for doing the Whole Earth catalog in the 1960s and 1970s, which was a big book that, if you've never seen it, lists every resource that's available to people and is noted as a precursor, a predecessor to the internet. Stewart Brand, one day, he wrote a piece for the project, and the story he tells is like a great one. He's in San Francisco. It's the early, I don't know, mid-1960s. He's tripping on acid. He's on a rooftop in San Francisco, and he's looking out, and he realizes that the horizon is curved, right? He's so stoned, he's looking at all the buildings, and he's realizing they're not parallel to each other, but they're all, a little askew. And then he realizes that he, in his stonedness, right, is like seeing things from a completely different perspective, and that we don't look at the Earth that way. So I don't know how stoned he was when he did this, but he dressed up and he had these buttons made up and wore an Uncle Sam costume and walked around the Berkeley campus handing these buttons out. And he handed these buttons out in a lot of places, basically saying, what does the Earth look like seen in a photograph from afar? And eventually an Apollo mission photograph shows it, and it becomes one of the transformative moments in environmental thinking and history, and it becomes the cover of the Whole Earth catalog. So the project, as I said, I reached out to a bunch of people, and the goal for the project was to advocate for a more accurate assessment of photography's reach and power. And so, because I was working at the Smithsonian and for the Smithsonian, I had access to a lot of people there, which was great. But I also decided to reach beyond that group to talk to other people. So this is the list of contributors that made it into the book. It's a really eclectic thing. It's everything, I got to call up Hugh Hefner and say, okay, what really was the story about the first issue of Playboy, and what are the issues behind Marilyn Monroe pictures, the history of censorship of the magazine. So I could talk to him. I could call up a woman who ran the Adoption Services Bureau for the state of New Mexico and say, how does photography work for you? And she said, nobody ever asked me that before. Here's how it changed adoption, right? We could not place siblings, right, with adoptive parents, right? And so we could not place kids who were aging out of the system. So she went out and she got this is in Santa Fe, got local photographers to take fantastic portraits of people, and they got one of the photo galleries to do a show of these photographs, and all of a sudden they were finding placements for these kids because of these photographs of them, right? The photographs made the kids adoptable. And this project proved to be so successful that it spread to 40 states. I got to call up Yost Stam, who I read about one day on Wired magazine. I read a great interview with him. He's the guy who invented Maya software. I had just seen some movie that had really wild special effects in it, and I'm thinking, how photographic do we want special effects to look, right? So I figured, okay, I'll call him up. So I did, and he, as many people said, when I asked him, like, how's photography change your work? How realistic, how photographic do we want these things to look? He said, nobody ever asked me that before. And I said, well, think about it. You're willing to think about it? And he did. So it kind of went on and on. I talked to people. People talk about the power of photography all the time as if it were solely a formal thing, like if you make beautiful pictures, they're going to be powerful, or they talk about them perhaps from a photojournalistic point of view. But the more I worked on this project, the more I thought, I got to talk to neurologists. I want to know literally what happens when you see a photograph. How do you deal with this information? How do we store it? How do we remember it? So I got to call up people like Jeremy Wolf, who is a neurobiologist in Boston. He teaches at MIT and Harvard and Women's and Brigham's Hospital. And he, right, for the project, put together this little test, right, which is a commonly used test about visual memory. You show someone 16 photographs, right? You let them look at them for a short period of time. You say, okay, I'm going to change 4 of the photographs in here, and I'm going to show you this grid again, right? And almost without fail, 95+% of the people can identify which of the 4 photographs have been switched out. And you can identify them the minute that you see it the first time. But if somebody comes back to you a week later and says, which were the pictures that got changed, you would know it. If somebody came back to you a month later, you would know it. If somebody came back to you even longer than that, you would know it. The upshot being that our visual memories, or memories for images, are the most powerful memory sense we have. Our visual for images is more powerful than our memory for language. It's more powerful than our sense of smell. which was a really interesting thing to talk about. I could go talk to people like John Waters, who I knew, and whose exhibition I curated, his retrospective I curated, and say to him, okay, how'd photography change you? And he talked about the pictures that he wanted to see when he was a kid, right? And goes to this FSA photograph by Russell Lee of a kid, looking at these kind of girly pictures, peep show pictures at a county fair in 1942, and wrote a very interesting piece about the first time that he saw pornography and what that did to him. I could talk to Lori Lambrecht, who is both an artist and friend, but also someone who makes a living as a wedding photographer, and say, how's photography changing your life? And she's basically telling you the story that I'm sure you may have heard or thought about in one way or another. People are taking their own pictures at their weddings, right? And so every wedding she shoots, this is, the bride's father taking pictures, and when the bride's trying on her dress, the bridesmaids are taking pictures, everybody is taking pictures. So it totally changes wedding photography. This, because it was the Smithsonian and the place is full of some wonderful, smart, and eccentric people, I got to call up the guy who's the curator of spiders, right, and say, okay, how photography changed what you do? And he said, nobody ever asked me that question, like everybody says, but then he thought about it. And we made some videos for the project, and this is one of them. This is Jonathan Coddington.
I'm Jonathan Coddington, and I'm the curator of spiders at the National Museum of Natural History. Okay, so photography wasn't essential for most of the history of spiders. What people did to study spiders was they would look through microscopes and draw them. They'd draw the parts that were interesting, and so it was a form of art, really. It was scientific illustration. But what we were missing was that spiders make webs, and the webs are specific to the sort of spider that makes them. And the whole way they interact with the world is designed in the architecture of their webs. So you couldn't see that, because if webs were visible to everybody, including the flies, nobody would run into them. The spiders would be, out of luck. So if you want to make a collection of spiders and study them, which is what we do here at the museum, you can collect the spider. But this great world that they live in of webs and how they hunt, we were never able to collect webs. People tried, and the process of collecting a web distorted their architecture so much that there was never any measurements you could get off of it. So the thing that's hard about photographing a web is, first of all, that the silk is invisible. You could do things like spritz them with water, and then they would get this sort of classic National Geographic, sway in the lines. Everything would be weighted down. It would ruin the architecture of the web. So Bill Eberhard, who also works for the Smithsonian, was facing this problem, and his mother actually said, Bill, why don't you use cornstarch? And it was like this eureka moment, and it's changed the history of the photography of webs. Photography became a way to document this aspect of spiders that we couldn't capture in any other way. So people started off with photography, taking pictures with pretty large format cameras. And then invention of the 35 millimeter camera, that was, I guess, in the early part of the 20th century. That changed it a lot. But the part that really jazzed scientists was the invention of the scanning electron microscope, which takes pictures with electrons, which is what you see behind me here. That's the picture of the spinning field of one of the spinnerets of a spider. Spiders have 7 or 8 different kinds of silk that they make. And what the scanning electron microscope did was it enabled us to have essentially infinite depth of field. The thing that is new on the block, and it is even more radical, I think, I mean, at least it's exciting to be doing it now, is stacking software. So you can focus at the top of the knees of a spider, which is what you're seeing over here, or you can focus a little bit further down or a little bit further down, but you can't see the whole thing. So now what we do, we'll take what's in focus at each of the shots as you go down, and it only keeps the part that's in focus, and then at the end it stacks it all together into one colossal sort of image that's completely in focus, top to bottom. We are systematically imaging the entire morphological atlas of spiders, and we're up to 33,000 images. We're excited because it allows us to actually take pictures of spiders and show stuff that we've never been able to see before, and it's the real deal.
So, yeah, I got to talk to Jonathan Coddington. I got to talk to Philippe Kahn, who is the man who invented the cell phone camera. Because I thought if anybody changed the world we lived in, it was him. And he tells basically the story about how he was sitting around while his wife was about to give birth to their first child, and he was bored in the waiting room at the hospital, and he had a phone with him, and he had a camera with him, and there was a Radio Shack across the street, and he went out and he bought what he needed to do, and he wired them up, and he sent out this photograph of his daughter. Right. Changed, totally changed history, and totally changed our lives and his life. Yeah. This is another short video. This is Lonnie Bunch, who is the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture that's being built on the mall now.
Creating the National Museum of African American History and Culture as part of the Smithsonian is probably not probably, it is the most difficult thing I've ever taken on in my career. Part of what I thought about was, how do I take a story that is unbelievably complex, how do I make it accessible? And it was clear to me that the best way to do that was through photography. I am Lonnie Bunch, the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. What I really am is a guy from New Jersey trying to make it in the big city. That's really it. When I was a kid, probably before I turned 5, I had a grandfather that used to read to me all the time. And unlike my kids who could read at 5, I couldn't. And one day we were looking at a history book and it had a picture of school children. And I don't remember if they were black, white, just school children. And he read the caption and it said, "Unidentified school children." And I remember just looking at their faces. And then I remember him saying, and this picture was taken so long ago, that these kids are probably all dead by now. And I remember thinking, how could kids that look like me, my age, be dead? And then he said, isn't it a shame that people could live their lives, die, and all it says is unidentified? And that notion of trying to find the story behind the faces, trying to identify who these people were, trying to make sure that they weren't just these anonymous figures, is what made me be a historian. And so I think that what photography does, for me as a historian, especially a historian of Black America, photography provides me a way into the African American experience that isn't documented in any other way. That for many of the people I write about, their stories didn't make the history books. Their stories didn't make a lot of the archives. So that I found myself shaped by the kind of family photos that I would find in people's homes, in their basements, in their attics, and they helped me do something that was really difficult and unusual when I began as a historian. What I love so much, whether it's the photography of Addison Scurlock or James Van Der Zee, or even sort of some of just the snapshots you see taken in the early 20th century, what I love about it is that there's a conscious decision to say, yes, you can capture the worst of who we are, and the kind of social documentary photography that became really the rage in the 30s. You can capture the worst of who we are, but we want to recognize that even in our worst circumstances, we interpret ourselves differently than you might. And so photography becomes a way that I can help people recognize that their history is valuable. I can help them see that the story of their grandmother is important to the broader narrative of American culture. So for me, photography solves so many problems. It is a great piece of evidence. It is a wonderful way to make people comfortable. It is an important entree point into complex history. And it is really something that, to this day, makes me want to know more about the people who were captured in that image.
This is, I mentioned the woman at NYU who was the visual anthropologist. Her name was Hedy Geismar. And we had been talking lots about how photography is all about being seen. And, you know, Lonnie Bunch is talking about what it means to be seen. She raises interesting issues, and anthropologists keep surprising me in terms of the way they think. It's like, what if we don't want to be? What happens to people who don't want to be seen? And so her work is done largely in Vanuatu in the South Pacific, where there are cultures where once someone dies, you don't talk about them. You don't mention someone's name, and the last thing you would want is for anybody to see a picture of those people. And so she wrote about how there are now websites and archives at museum that restrict access to images because people don't think that other people should see them, which was interesting. I mentioned Hugh Hefner and Playboy magazine and the kind of conversations we had. We also reached out to kids. I've gotten really interested in visual literacy through this project. The idea that we live in this universe where so many pictures are being made all the time and people don't talk about them much, especially to kids. So another intern of mine's sister ran the language arts program in Lincoln, Nebraska, and she started doing some curriculum around this in this classroom. She used photography. She asked kids to bring in pictures to think about the concept of fiction and nonfiction. And this is an 8th grader, his name is Tien Nguyen, who brought in this picture of himself and wrote a little essay about why was he smiling in this picture in the first place. He was really unhappy when this picture got taken, which I thought was a really interesting thing. So the project, as I mentioned, was seen by hundreds of thousands of people online, and the book is out, and Aperture published it. It's in its 3rd printing now, which is kind of nice. And it's got entries by 80 people, and each one of them had a really interesting story to tell. And that what part of what the project proves is that far from being a universal language, which is what people like to say about photography, the meanings and the values that we extract from photographs are always dependent on our needs and the perspectives that we bring to them, which people forget about also. And what became really clear to me in the course of doing this project was that if photography was changing everything was too big a concept for me or anybody else to wrap their minds around. So the project got structured in a really simple way. It was photography changes what we want. It's all about photography and desire. It's about photography changing what we see, meaning you can see macro worlds, micro worlds, things you have no access to. It changes who we are in terms of the way photography shapes identity. It changes what we do. It changes all of our work. It changes where we go, literally and figuratively, and most of all, it changes what we remember. And so that's how the book got organized and explored one at a time. The individual stories kind of add up to this vivid discussion about how and why photographs hold our attention and the ways that they raise our hopes and they crush our hopes and the ways that they transform us in the world we live in. So once the project got finished, and because I work as an independent curator and writer and producer of projects, I had to figure out what I was going to do next. And as I said, the Smithsonian Project was eye-opening for me. It was an extraordinary opportunity. And it was transformative, and it made me think very, very broadly about photography, and was the first time that I was able to work in an interdisciplinary way across such a wide range of people. While I was at the Smithsonian, we launched a blog that was called The Bigger Picture, that was about the Photography Initiative, and I started writing about visual culture and news from visual culture, which was interesting. And then when the Photography Initiative changed, and it was time for me to go away and figure out something else to do, I kind of missed the public voice that I had on a blog. So I thought, what am I going to do? And I didn't want to have a blog of my own because I thought it's going to be too much work. It takes too much time to write the research and write all this stuff. What am I going to do? I had lunch with a friend. He said, start working on Twitter. So I had never used Twitter. I had no interest in Twitter. I thought Twitter was stupid. And then I looked at it and then I thought, all right, how can I use this? And then I started realizing that for the Photography Initiative blog, what I was doing was looking around for news about visual imaging, and that I could just do it on my own. So a year ago in April, I started this project called Why We Look, right? And I saw it as a way to build upon the work I had done at the Smithsonian and a way to further explore the ideas that I was interested in, but having more freedom than I had working for an institution. I mean, there are things if you work for the Smithsonian that you can and that you kind of can't do because it gets it could be maybe too controversial. It's not, there's certain kind of areas I wasn't able to go in, certainly, that I wanted to. So all of a sudden I realized I could look at photography any way I wanted to with this project. I could look at how images were made and used, and why they dazzle and seduce us, and why they confuse us, and why they get us so worked up. And I also wanted to look more critically at how photographs to varying degrees convey power and authority, and how they can be efficient, and how they can be distracting, and how they can fuel narcissism, and how they can create communities. So basically, what I do every night before I go to sleep is I spend about 45 minutes sorting through various online news reports and blog posts about imaging and visual culture. And the next day, around 1 in the afternoon, I post usually 3 stories a day on Twitter, and 2 on the weekends, and have in the last year and a half been building up a really interesting audience for this. My goal, right, in doing this, and my goal in doing all the projects I do, is to engage as many people as possible in looking as broadly as possible at photography. And as the medium is in the midst of transformation, I want people to look at what makes them look at pictures and take them in the first place, and then what happens after they do. My goal is not to try to nail down some single story or rationale for what photography is, and I'm not interested in advocating for one or another factional views of how the medium does or should work. What I want to do is acknowledge and celebrate photography as a moving target. That's the way I've been thinking about it lately. Photography changes everything. Photography changes itself. The medium is always changing. And what I'm able to do by pointing at all of these stories is to kind of highlight that, and to keep underscoring the fact that when it comes to photography, there's a lot to marvel at, there's a lot to admit to, and there's a lot to reconsider. In 2003, Urs Stahl, who's founding director of the Photo Museum Winterthur in Switzerland, talked about this in a lecture that he did, was called What is Photography? He said, without hesitation, he wrote, people take a deep breath and announce in a booming voice, this is photography. No, this is photography. This isn't photography anymore. You are wrong. This is photography. The more forceful the claim, the more likely it is that someone is standing nearby, ready to declare the same 3 words just as emphatically, but with completely different meaning in mind. So what's impressive to me about photography, as I said, is that it resists being tamed by any special set of interests or perspectives, and that it plays a pivotal role in defining our rational lives and our fantasy lives. And that's what I'm basically doing these days at this moment of change. I'm interested in the democratic nature of photography. I'm interested in photography as a malleable medium. I'm interested in the dialogue around this. And for some people who think that the democracy of photography and its malleability are problematic, that's their problem. But we're entering a time now where there's this shift from analog to digital imaging that is making some people nervous. This is from a series of photographs by a guy named Robert Burley, who traveled around the country documenting the end of Kodak, right? This is the explosion of 2 buildings at Kodak this is about 4 or 5 years ago. And on that front, what I've been really interested in is how often in the last couple of years you hear people, and it's usually in the context of art or art photography and art museums and galleries, writing about the crisis in photography, the death of photography, and they get really worked up about it, and talk about how it's the role of artists to rupture traditional stories about photography when the story that they're telling about photography is pretty traditional on its own, and pretty limiting. Photography has always been complicated. In the 19th century, it's Henry Fox Talbot on the right. All the issues that we're facing in photography were similarly raised, back at that point. 19th century practitioners knew it. Writers like John Tagg and Jeffrey Batchen, who I mentioned earlier, have repeatedly said that the medium is complicated and has many, many voices and many stories going through it. Artists like Gerhard Richter, this is a page from his project Atlas, Thomas Ruth, Catherine Opie, Roe Etheridge have all been making very restless kind of work that jumps from genre to genre, and also kind of explores the idea that there is no simple story to tell about photography, and there never was, right? When I first became interested in photography, Edward Steichen said in 1969, I thought it was the whole cheese. My idea was to have it recognized as one of the fine arts. Today, he said in 1969, I don't give a hoot in hell about all of that. The mission of photography is to explain man to man and each man to himself. And so this is an installation shot from the Family of Man in 1955, right? And say what you want to about Steichen, and people criticize the Family of Man show, always have and always will. But what's interesting about him is the guy started out as a darling of the 20th century avant-garde. He's an avant-garde painter and photographer who then went on to see photography differently and reshape military photography, fashion photography, portraiture, celebrity photography, and advertising photography. And he got it right each time, right? And he got it right each time because he was unapologetic about embracing the central role that images play in our lives. So ironically, it's like after Steichen's death in the 1970s that a more insulated approach to creative photography that he turned away from starts to emerge in the art world, which I was part of, as was described. And over 4 decades, the number of artists using photography and the number of art photographers have multiplied, as have the number of galleries and the number of private collections and the number of MFA programs and the number of festivals, the amount of theory and the amount of prizes, 5- and 6-figure prizes that people are winning. This is Simon Norfolk, who is a totally wonderful guy, but clearly excited to have gotten 100,000 Swiss francs a couple of years ago. As a former gallerist and an artist representative, as was mentioned, and as I kind of just said, as an independent curator and writer, I've done my share to bolster what's myopically been called the photography world. But the point is, there is no photography world. There's lots of them, right? And as a result, the art and photography worlds may not be the most or the best or the most hospitable place to talk about what photography is and may become. So we have no choice, right? Because we use photography so much to keep rethinking the medium and our relationships to it. What's new now is that the medium and reasons for and options for defining photographs and making photographs and mining photographs and sharing photographs are increasing exponentially. What photography is, what photographs are, what the photographic means are continually evolving and dramatically. This is a photograph that's made by John Sear, who is also in the MFA photo program, who spent a couple of years traveling around the country to photograph photographers developing trays, because he realized that these trays in which images and history used to happen are not useful anymore. So as the medium is changing and as our relationships to the medium and the world and each other are changing, it's, I keep thinking we got to keep talking about it. The more photography and imaging change, the more it seems to me as if Steichen was right, that if you want to understand the boundaries of photographic vision and how the thinking around photography is being redrawn and how our lives and identities are being reshaped by images and through images, and how consequential photography really is not in an art world sense necessarily, although it can be, but in a life and death sense, then in fact we've got to look around, we've got to reimagine photography, right? And if you do, and when you do, you'll see that certain themes lately keep popping up around images. So I just want to go through a couple of the themes that keep turning around today. That I keep seeing and thinking about. The first is what images do and what they need to be. When I was working on Photography Changes Everything, Jeremy Wolf, the neurobiologist, told me about the work of a woman named Aude Oliva, who's at MIT, who's been working on projects exploring scene perception. She's trying to figure out how much perceptual information we actually need to extract from whatever's in front of us and how do we process it. How do we get what she calls the gist of a scene, right? So this is part of her work. She shows people photographs like the top one and says, what's it a photograph of? And in like a thousandth of a millisecond, people can say what it is. In this case, the bottom picture shows how certain kinds of shapes, right? What we see, we perceive shapes, we perceive contrast, we perceive context. And here they're kind of playing around with, is that a car? Is that a fire hydrant? It's the same kind of image that's turned around. But the point is, you get the gist of the scene really, really fast. You do not need to see so much in photographs. We perceive meaning and extract it really quickly, which raises very interesting questions about how closely we need to look at photographs in the first place and what happens to us when we do, right? We assume, and we assume that photographs are going to look a certain way, and that's only because of the way they've been engineered to look so far, right? Which is part of what's interesting about photography now. Years ago, when I was working at Light Gallery in the 1970s, which represented a lot of old master photographers and new ones, we did like the first Stephen Shore show, we did the first Robert Mapplethorpe show, we did the first Jan Groover show. There was one day I was showing a client photographs, and I get excited about looking at pictures and I like to talk about them, and I try to elicit, comments from people. And this woman just like looked at me and she said, photographs make me nervous. Photography makes me nervous. And I thought I was like stunned, right? Because I thought she was having fun and she wasn't, clearly. And then I tried to figure out like what was making her nervous, right? And what are the reasons that she might have said that? This is a still from Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up, right? That's a movie about photography and what you can and can't see in pictures. So I immediately sensed that this woman was like not confident that she had the methodology or the language or the training to talk about what she saw. A lot of people feel that way around photographs if you make them talk about them. But there was another reason for her being nervous about this, but I didn't realize it until years later when everybody around me was talking about the indexicality of photographic images and how photographs capture everything in terms of information. And it may be the case that there may be too much detail in photographs. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that people could be being made nervous by photographs that tell them too much or that they're made to look at too closely. So I got real interested in how we've come to think about photography a certain way and how in laboratories around the country, engineers and researchers are rethinking photography through computational photography. Once photography went digital, right, you could make a photograph look a different way, right? That's a huge step, right? And so what can you do to change what a photograph is and make it do its job better, right? Perhaps. So that got me really interested in computational photography, and people like Andreas Velten, who's part of the camera culture group at MIT's Media Lab, who's developing systems where you can measure and analyze bursts of light that are coming from a camera so you can see around corners, right? So basically you set up a camera, you have a laser light, the laser light smacks into the wall, hits the little running figure, bounces off the wall, comes back to the camera, algorithmically, you measure all of that, you arrange it, and you can see the figure on the other side of the camera, which is extraordinary, right? And it's something that's useful for firefighters, right? And it's useful for emergency rescuers. And of course, it's useful to the military too, and DARPA funds research like this. The biggest innovators in imaging technology are the government, and it's DARPA, right? Which is a whole other, thing. But the point is, this is photography showing things that are hidden from sight, right? And then about going back to this notion of nervous making, the nervous makingness, surveillance is, clearly something that's on everybody's mind. And I've gotten really, really interested in surveillance stories. Among them are stories about the police and law enforcement agencies around the country using license plate readers. This is one, right? And what they are able to do. People, I had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with a research scientist who works at NASA, and he was saying, well, yeah, from like 60,000 feet, you can read something that's 5 inches wide, right? And he said, and that's what I know about. Right, and I thought, all right, this is interesting. So these license plate readers can scan license plates and excerpt that information and put together dossiers of where the car has been, if there's any tickets against the car, if there's any kind of lawsuits against the owner of the car, and track where that car has been and can follow where that car is going to, right? Which I think is, kind of amazing, right? I'm fascinated by facial recognition software, which I'm sure you're all aware of, right? But, it's being used at airports and stadiums and public events. But, a month or so ago, Facebook, right, basically said, okay, we're going to do facial recognition on everybody's pictures, everybody's pictures, their profile pictures, and so it's going to be great because when you appear in a picture, everybody's going to know it's you, and all your friends don't have to bother tagging it. We'll do it for you, right? Didn't happen yet, right? And if my interest makes me sound like I'm a paranoid kind of person, I'm not, right? I like looking at things and I like talking about pictures and thinking about pictures, but that one of the things I'm fascinated with is that for a medium that is in one way or the other always about control. It's like what you frame in a picture, right? Or what you do with the information in a picture. Lately, as I'm looking at all these stories, I'm getting this feeling that the medium is kind of out of control, which for me is equally fascinating and problematic. So I'm liking stories about images out of control. There was one a couple of months ago when Agence France, the biggest press agency in Europe, circulated this picture of Francois Hollande, the president of France, and he was horrified that he looked like such a dork, and he tried to get them to recall it. And the agency tried to recall it, and then everybody started screaming, "It's out there. You can't recall this picture, right? You put it out there, it's out." Okay? I'm fascinated and angered by pictures like this one, which is two guys at their engagement in 2010 in New Jersey, right, celebrating this, who put their picture up on the internet, and in 2012, right, that picture gets used, the background gets stripped out, and it's used in an attack mailer in Colorado for to kind of bring down a Republican who supports same-sex marriage. I'm fascinated by pictures like this, right, of Beyonce at the Super Bowl halftime show that was put online, and she requested BuzzFeed remove it, right, and then basically started banning professional photographers from her concerts because she thought the image was unflattering, right, when in fact it's part of a video, it's part of something that was seen by 108 million people live, right? Or Prince, right, and a lot of other people, a lot of other performers are basically saying, no photography allowed at our concerts, listen to the music, right? Listen to the music instead of photographing the experience of listening to music. I was fascinated by the controversy that kind of bubbled up last spring when this guy, Arne Svensson, had a show at Julie Saul Gallery and showed what to me are a little too tasteful photographs of his Tribeca neighbors, which he shot through the plate glass windows of their uncurtained multi-million-dollar apartments across the street. And they proceeded to launch a slew of lawsuits against the guy, right? Basically saying, how could he be looking at us? And he's basically saying, you left the windows open. It's like being on the street. I can take pictures of anything I want. They're saying, if he took pictures of, how do I know he didn't take pictures of my children? How do I know I didn't do this? How do I know this and that? The court ruled in his favor, basically. So, but it was a really interesting conversation. I'm fascinated and also horrified by inappropriate sharing of pictures, which I think photographic ethics are a huge and interesting topic. So you get a situation like this, right? This is a photograph that was made in 2011 of a nurse who's been anesthetized in the hospital she works at and is about to have an operation. And the anesthesiologist, who's a friend of hers, and the nurse's aide, who's a friend of hers, think, this is fun. Let's put a decal of a mustache and tears on her and photograph her, which they did, right? And then they started sending it out, and then the thing gets on the internet, and she freaks out, and she says, this is a complete breach of medical ethics, right? And so this police taking pictures, EMS people taking pictures, huge issues around all of this stuff. And so, I'm kind of fascinated by digital imaging having a dark side to it. And at the same time, there's all of these great opportunities for pictures too. There's a lot of talk lately about these things. These are a little camera. It's being released this month, right? These things are this big, right? And they're clip-ons. It was called the Momodo until Motorola sued them. This was the Swedish company that makes them because they've trademarked the word Moto. So now the camera's called the Narrative, okay? It's the Narrative clip camera. You wear it, you can clip it on your clothes. It takes a picture every 30 seconds, all day. Right? And so over the course of the day, you're making 6,000 pictures, and the pictures get stored to a cloud, and you can, where they're algorithmically sorted, and you can, if you want, have the narrative or Momodo gods like pick out the best pictures of your day. But this too is sparking privacy issues, right? As because who knows whose picture is being taken? You know, same issue that goes along with Google Glass, which is something else I'm completely fascinated with. You know, this is in development, has been in development for a while. People have been starting to wear them. You can shoot videos, you can shoot still images hands-free of anything you want to, and it's been used to transmit surgeries live, right? So doctors can do surgeries and share them with people, you know, other doctors in real time. It's been used, as you might imagine, to make porn movies, right? This is the first porn movie made with Google Glass. And it's raising even more privacy and data collection issues that are leavening the enthusiastic adoption issues by some of these things. Last week, I read a piece by a guy from Stanford, a professor at Stanford University named Mark Lavoie, who spoke about Google Glass and other devices like it and their potential game-changing computational imaging capabilities and how they'll allow for the equivalent of superhero vision, right? Which is kind of cool, right? And also can be problematic. Wearing cameras with increased processing power that'll be engineered into them is going to fuel a whole new generation of powerful photographic tools. And at some point in the very near future, wearers are going to be able to see details and shadows. This is the superhero part. You're going to be able to see things in completely dark rooms, and you'll be able to overlay data, online data, with images that you see or images you make. The point of all of this is that with over 1 billion pictures being made and shared by people every day who are not what you'd call photographers, we're in the midst of this transformative moment in photography and global culture. Photographs are no longer things, they're experiences, and people are starting to both say and understand it. Photographs are absolutely malleable, and while their use and their audience and meaning have always been fluid, we're just starting to realize the impact of that for good and for ill, and in some of the most exciting and radical moments in human history, which I think are now. I think this is like the best time in photography in the last 40 years. Our new relationship to photographic imaging is less about witnessing, it's less about evidence, it's less about documentation. As photojournalist Stephen Mays commented in an interview in Wired magazine last summer, he's saying it's much more about experience. Photography is about sharing, it's about the moment, it's about streaming. In the past, people were conditioned by film and camera companies to know what they needed to take pictures of and when and how. And today, and now the cameras are bundled into consumer electronics and appliances, more and more of us are taking pictures not of what's important, but of what's weird or cool or curious, right? Kind of like Andy Warhol did. I mean, we are this kind of like this different relationship to imagery in the world we live in is gone mainstream. The kind of freedom and open-ended approach that picture making once was the domain of artists who could be counted on to stretch the limits of what imaging is and what image making might mean is no longer the case. I just want to end by showing you guys a short clip from this guy, Doug Rushkoff. He's a futurist. And this was a keynote speech that he gave last year at the 7-on-7 event at the New Museum in New York, where he proposed that when it comes to pushing the frontiers of imaging, the relationship of artist to imaging and technology has been upended.
Over time, and this is the interesting thing, over the last 20 years, I feel like there's been a kind of a reversal where artists were originally very valuable to the Silicon adventures because of their sort of unrestricted, less bound, and in some sense less disciplined approach to the way these things work, that now in the sort of more ITP rhizome era, the technologists are the ones who are less bound by by the kinds of constraints that we normally put ourselves under, and it's the artists who are actually bringing the kind of social and intellectual discipline to the work of the technologists. So when I was a kid, I was thinking, oh, the artist is the crazy, long-haired, weird person who's thinking strange thoughts, and the technologist is like, well, actually what you're doing here is a whole lot. Where now, when I come here or go to ITP or a place or talk to people working with Rhizome, it's the technologist who's like, oh my God, I could take this thing and put it in here and we'll get it, it's going to replicate and blah, blah, blah. And it's the artist who's like, well, actually, in a Deleuzian sense, what we're looking at is a reification of commodity culture. It's like, wow. So, the artists are the ones who are going to school, right? Getting MFAs and DFAs, while the technologists were there on the beach with Unix for dummies, and they become, a Python programmer in 3 days. So there's this.
Okay. When I looked at that the other day, I thought the guy's right, in a certain kind of way. I'm like completely fascinated by this. That current issues in imaging are, for me, the most provocative part of imaging now, right? Talking about what photography is, how it's changing, is what's really, really interesting, and much more interesting to me than some of the inside the beltway art that is being made about these issues. The photographic moment that we're living through suggests that not only is photography changing everything, but that as it does, we've got to talk about these changes. We've got to do that as best as we can and as they occur, and not just within the confines of the art world, which, as I've said multiple times, I guess today, has a restricted view of the medium. And as we do look at photography and talk about it, what I've learned in the past couple of years is that we also need to rethink not only what photography is and what it may become, but as I said earlier, we need to rethink the ethics of photography, what photography should be, and that means thinking what visual literacy means, right? Visual literacy is something that over the last 2 years it just dawns on me more and more, that having the skills necessary to understand what photography's power is and where that power lies, right, is something that we all pay lip service to. Everybody talks about visual literacy and nobody teaches it, very few people teach it, and nobody's doing much to promote it, which is something that I think has got to change. And how that's going to happen, giving our ever-increasing access to cameras and the ramifications of what photography may become, is a hugely important issue, and it's a pressing one, and something that involves a lot of discussion for now that's better left for another time. I'm actually starting to work with Charles Traub over at MFA Photo and some people in the Department of Education in New York City to come up with pilot programming for teaching visual literacy to kids. And I'm interested in starting to do it at the kindergarten level. And instead of teaching kids, the kind of ad-busters way of dealing with photography, which is important to understand how we're being manipulated through advertising, but it's way more than that. So I'll leave you with that. It's like visual literacy is where I think this is all going to. The photographs are not going away. I just started being a guest blogger for Photo Museum Winter Tour in Switzerland this week, and I wrote a little piece called The River about how many photographs they are and this notion of their out of controlness. And the first comment was, how are we going to deal with all of this? And I think that's a really interesting issue. And I think one of the issues is going to be talking about it and talking about the visual literacy issues. And then another important issue is about the archiving of photographs and what that's going to be about too. But again, that's another time. I've talked long enough. So thank you for coming. And I think
We will
questions.
Take a few questions.
How do we visual artists create the narrative to captivate the audience and literate it, and so that we can start talking with images? No,
The question is, how can we do it, right?
Yes,
How do you do it?
yes.
It's a really good question. It's which is why I keep thinking, start in kindergarten, right? It's like if you get people making pictures, right, you can talk to them about pictures. That's what the Photography Changes Everything project was about, and I've done things like that. There are artists like Wendy Ewald, who's done projects like this for years, where she's worked with kids and given them cameras and worked with women's groups and worked all around the world to do it. And I think that's one way to do it. You have to, it's this idea of having conversation about photography, and then the question is, where can you have this conversation? And going back to what I said, you can't have this conversation in art museums because they don't care about these issues so much. It's not part of the narrative that they've chosen to tell. So I keep looking around the photography world and saying, okay, who's going to take a leadership position, right, in this, and let's start dealing with this. And the answer is it's very hard to get somebody to do that. A year ago, I was at Aperture talking about the Photography Changes Everything project. And this is when I started talking about the visual literacy thing. And Charlie Traub, who's the head of MFA Photo, who I work with, right, says, we know how to do it. We know how to teach visual literacy. We can't get into schools, right? And somebody else who's there, who happens to be my neighbor, right, who is a former school principal who now supervises 36 other principals in New York City, said, stop calling it art. There's no room to teach art in schools. You can't do this in schools if you call it art. Schools are like so under the gun to teach what is supposedly literacy, right? That this seems frivolous. But what we've been finding out is for the last 10 years, there's people around the world, right, financed by Adobe doing white papers on visual literacy, and people doing projects in Australia who are basically saying there's multi-streams of literacy. There's multiple literacies. We've got to teach language, arts, language literacy. We've got to teach photographic image literacy. We've got to teach data literacy, the same way that people are saying we should be teaching everybody how to program and code, right? So I mean, that was, talk about bells going off. This like, don't call it art was, I think, at the center of it. So how to do it, it's gonna take some time. What we're trying to do over at MFA Photo is next summer, start a 1-week intensive project and work with educators and people in the visual literacy field to start to put together programming like this. But I think it's hugely important, and I think your question's an interesting one. It's like, how do you do it? Kids need to know this, right? I mean, you kind of look at all of the kind of issues around how people are portrayed, whether it's around eating disorders or, a 14-year-old suing fashion magazines saying stop using Photoshop pictures, right? There's like all of those issues are going on. You routinely I look at the newspapers, I read these stories all the time about visual culture, and routinely now the media runs a story, there'll be something happens in Syria, somebody will run a picture from Iraq to illustrate the story, right? Somebody writes a gag story about a dating agency using the picture of the brother of the former Polish president, who's a notorious bachelor who has a lot of cats and is a weird person. And they're basically using a picture in their ass to say, hey, if we can find a date for this weird guy, right, we can help you too. But they use a picture of his twin brother, the late president of Poland, who died in a plane crash, right? I mean, so there's this irresponsibility, right, around pictures, and that's part of what I'm talking about too. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked about malleability of photography and irresponsibility. I think photography is probably the most visual of a lot of things that are happening, most visible because it is visual. But this malleability, how long can we accept it? I mean, it's happening in politics, it's happening in humor, it's happening in food, it's happening in all spheres of our life. I mean, it's like the anything goes period.
Yes.
So I find that to be really dangerous. I mean, like, for example, at the Museum of Modern Art, there's an exhibit of photography. I haven't seen it in person because I'm sort of reluctant, but I've saw pictures on the internet where this person, new acquisition, has got a photograph, but it's all covered with like wood and stuff like that. It's no longer a photograph. So how much longer can we accept things to just keep going? Anything goes.
I think, the cows are out of the barn, the train's on the track, and imaging is changing. And it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of MIT and algorithmic imaging. It's all changing. And I think you just have to acknowledge that. And I think that just the same way that there is no single story you can tell about photography, there is no longer any real photography world, and that people find themselves more comfortable in one place or another. And my position is, this, as I said, this is like the most interesting time in terms of photography, because it's what we assume to be a photograph no longer necessarily holds. And as soon as Photoshop, first side text and then Photoshop gets introduced, everybody's saying there goes truth, right? We're screwed. And it is what it is, right? And so you need to know all of this stuff, which goes back to the visual literacy thing. I think there's no way I don't think there's any way to stop this, nor do I think we want to stop it, because I think the kinds of things that we're seeing through imaging are extraordinary, right? I mean, there are people who can literally watch ions move in a cell, right? I mean, these kinds of imaging breakthroughs are going to change our lives drastically, right? So I don't think you want to change these things. And then it goes back to what I was saying about this control issue. Yeah, things are kind of out of control. And so what do you do about it, right? I mean, all you can do is kind of watch it, right? And it's about vigilance, right? It's about you needed to be vigilant in a certain kind of way, which is interesting because that's what photography was always about in the first place, right? And so instead of like, you know, the panopticon idea, like, you know, we're all being watched, we've got to watch everything else. We've got to watch everything that's going on. And so, and you see that that starts to change things too. Like in, one of the things that's been interesting to me is the whole idea of surveillance, right? The idea that we look at authorities and we take pictures of them. And all of a sudden that changes court cases, right? So if, you know, people were getting mistreated during the Republican National Convention because the administration thought it was like an unruly thing to do and they got manhandled, there's pictures to prove it, right? Fred Richin, who writes about some of these issues all the time and is eloquent and brilliant about this, and, you know, has been saying this for years, although it's only recently that people are really kind of getting it. He's saying if you have enough people taking pictures, you can't have people denying that something that happened, right? So there's that aspect to it too. It works both ways, and I think it's just understanding that this visual world we live in is radically different than what we thought it was, and that what photography is, and you know, as I said it earlier, what's a photograph, right? I mean, I teach, you know, in the MFA program. I'm like fascinated that there are all these people thinking they're going to be artists around photography and have no clue about what it means to make an object, right? They're all making digital images and they are having a hard time figuring out like what to make out of these things, right? So I think we're just in that kind of period, right? And I think, as I said, you know, people are saying, oh, it's a crisis. And it's not, but it's a kind of an amazing time.
Hello, Marvin.
Hello, David.
Thank you for your inspiring talk about digital photography and intelligence of imagery. My question is, photography the way it is, digital photography as you describe it, as we know it, okay? Where do we draw into the possibilities for our own careers, you know? Like, what can we do? Where's that revelation? You talk about a lot of things. There might be some really big thing waiting for us. Could you talk about that possibility?
I think that digital imaging offers people extraordinary opportunities to rethink how they make images and how they produce images and how they disseminate images. So I think it's, you know, if you believe that artists see things differently than the rest of us, which I do, right? It's not like I'm completely over that. I believe that. But I think that people have to kind of get with the program. I mean, you know, and realize that this is like, what do you make work for who, right? Make work for what? Do you want to make work for galleries? Do you want to make work for hedge fund people to like buy and sell to each other? Do you want to do projects online? Do you want to reach targeted audiences? Do you want to affect change? You know, I think the opportunities are extraordinary, right? I think the mindset is changing. I think, you know, it's always been the case that artists lead art, right? They lead the discussion. They're the ones that see the new stuff that happens first. They figure it out. They start talking. Other people listen. And it happens. And I think that's still the case. So I think digital imaging provides amazing opportunities to people. But what you choose to do with it is up to you.
Okay, one moment. So, Marvin, I want to thank you very much for giving us a lot to think about. And one little thing, once a year, the department, we design a T-shirt. And last year, I was at Aperture, and I bought your book. And then on the back of it, we wrote, and this is for you, digital photography changes everything.
I love it.
So I'd like to present you with that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That's great.
Okay,
I'll wear it proudly.
thank you very much, everybody.